In early June 1862, Robert E. Lee had assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia after Joseph E. Johnston had been wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines. The Union, though victorious, had done little to capitalize on their solid hold. George B. McClellan, being overly cautious, decided to prepare his positions on the southern bank of the Chickahominy River, giving him some time to bring up his siege guns for the long siege that stood before him. Lee, however, was not content with sitting idle behind his defenses. Lee was preparing for what would become a major counterattack against the Army of the Potomac. In order to determine where to best strike, Lee had greenlit an ambitious reconnaissance mission by Major General Jeb Stuart's cavalry contingent. On the 12th, Stuart set out from Richmond, going through Elmont, riding around McClellan's army north of the Chickahominy, crossing the river, and returning to Lee's headquarters on the 15th. The ambitious, 60-mile-long ride was an astonishing success, bringing about critical information necessary for Lee to conduct his own, equally ambitious counteroffensive. During the ride, Stuart had discovered that the forces north of the Chickahominy had been weakened. Only one corps, the 5th Corps, were north of the river. The rest had been positioned to the south nearby Seven Pines and stretching north towards the Chickahominy by New Bridge. With this vital piece of information, Lee could come up with his plan. He sent letters to Jackson, A.P. Hill, D.H. Hill, and James Longstreet, asking for them to come to his headquarters in order to discuss his strategy. On the 23rd of June, both Hills, Jackson, who had set out at 1 a.m. from Louisa County Courthouse, Longstreet, and Lee met up at the Dabbs House, a small brick farmhouse on the outskirts of Richmond. There, Lee detailed his plans and issued General Order No. 75. In it, he specified that General Jackson would advance from the north towards the south via Pole Green Church. A.P. Hill, D.H. Hill, and James Longstreet would advance from the south, crossing the Chickahominy, with Longstreet advancing to cut off their line of retreat via New Bridge. All the while, Huger, Magruder, and several cavalry detachments would hold their positions south of the Chickahominy, keeping an eye out for any potential troop movements. With the plans established, the order was given to their respective generals, and the preparations were made. However, on the 25th of June, McClellan had made his first move in nearly a month. Less than a mile west from the crossroads at Seven Pines, 3 brigades from the 2nd and 3rd Corps assaulted sections of the Confederate forces nearby French's Farm. The battle, later known as the Battle of Oak Grove, or the Battle of French's Farm, only saw a modest gain for the Federal troops. With no further assaults along this front, Lee continued his ambitious plans, letting the elements of his army get into position before they began their assault. On the 26th of June, 1862, Lee's forces began the execution of the ambitious plan. Jackson had been delayed by 6 hours, which led to Lee holding off on ordering A.P. Hill's division to cross at Meadow Bridge at 3 p.m., much later than he had intended. D.H. Hill and James Longstreet followed suit, moving up the Mechanicsville Turnpike. Before long, Confederate forces clashed with John Porter's 5th Corps in the small village before confronting his defensive positions along Beaver Dam Creek. Battle shortly followed as Confederate forces assaulted the Union position, but with no substantial gain. However, in spite of Porter's successful defense, Jackson, who was rapidly advancing from Ashland towards Pole Green Church, threatened the 5th Corps' right flank, prompting him to withdraw his forces at the creek overnight. Porter's main base of operation was situated on a bluff of the Chickahominy River known locally as Turkey Hill, on the property of widow Sarah Bohannon Watt, this property being also known as the Springfield Plantation. The natural high point is bordered by the Chickahominy to the south, while a small creek, Boatswain Creek, wrapped around the west and north of the position. The creek, though small and slow-moving, had carved a deep ravine in the soft soil that separated the hill from the rest of the area. It was a formidable barrier, a perfect location to set up a strong defensive line, which Porter understood all too well. Over the night of the 26th and the morning of the 27th, Porter's Fifth Corps spent the time reinforcing the position. They felled trees and stacked them up to make rudimentary defensive works along the southern slope of the ravine, while the artillery was stationed on the crest of the hill, over 50 feet above the base of the creek, primed and ready for any assault against their position. It wasn't until the afternoon of the 27th that A.P. Hill's division made it to the defensive works, passing by the ruins of Gaines's Mill and assembling near New Cold Harbor. As soon as they had been spotted by the Federals on Turkey Hill, their artillery began to open fire on the division.
Fire! Fire!
Between 2:30 and 4 p.m., Hill had organized an impromptu assault of the well-defended Federal position, only for this initial assault to be driven back. Ewell's detachment of Jackson's forces had arrived behind A.P. Hill's division after they had attempted their assault of the Federal position. In a similar move, Ewell would launch his own assault against the Federal positions, meeting much of the same fate as A.P. Hill's assault. During this assault, the 1st Louisiana Zouave Battalion, known as the Louisiana Tigers, would engage in Ewell's assault. During the fighting, Major Chantham Robideau Wheat, commander of the Louisiana Tigers, was struck and killed during the ensuing firefight. Born in Alexandria, Virginia on April 9, 1826, Wheat, a prominent Louisiana politician and an eccentric man, had formed the Louisiana Tigers early in the war. He and his unit fought at First Manassas and throughout the Valley Campaign under Jackson's command. They had built up a reputation of rowdiness in camp and on the march, but dogged determination in battle. But both the battalion and Wheat himself would meet their demise during Ewell's failed assault. He was 36 years old at the time of his death. After the failure of the second assault, Lee would organize a third assault against the strong defenses on Turkey Hill and towards the east nearby the intersections at Old Cold Harbor. The assault would see Jackson, A.P. Hill, D.H. Hill, and Longstreet send their divisions forward in a coordinated strike against the well-positioned Federals. This assault would begin late in the day, at 7 p.m., as the sun began setting towards the western horizon. In the center, General John Bell Hood commanded a brigade composed of the 1st, 4th, and 5th Texas, along with the 18th Georgia as a part of Whiting's division in Jackson's command. The Texas Brigade, as they were called, began their march across the wheat field that preceded the drop down towards Boatswain Creek. Taking personal command of the 4th Texas, Hood ordered his men to fix bayonets and to charge the Union lines. The Texans rolled forward like a gray tide, advancing down the sharp slopes, down into the creek basin, and crashing into the Union front lines. The Union forces in the center, after having fought for well over 6 hours, broke and fled up the slopes, blocking their artillery from firing. The Texans swept forward like a gray tidal wave as they captured the Federal artillery positions on Turkey Hill. They had broken the Federal center and started a rout of Porter's Fifth Corps. By the end of the fighting, though, Hood's Texas Brigade suffered a 25% casualty rate. Out of the 500 men of the 4th Texas, 21 were killed, 63 were wounded, and 1 was missing. Many of the wounded would eventually pass away from various complications caused by their injuries, suffered that day. Sergeant Albert Polk Brown of Company A of the 4th Texas was born on September 24th, 1840, in Bastrop County, Texas. Both he and his younger brother, Lycurgus McNeil Brown, enlisted into Company A of the 4th Texas in July 1861. However, during the winter of 1861, both brothers would fall ill after an outbreak of measles struck the Texans in their winter quarters in Dumfries, Virginia. Albert would survive, making a full recovery. Lycurgus, however, would not. Lycurgus would pass away on December 27th, 1861, in Dumfries, Virginia. He would later be laid to rest in the Confederate cemetery in Fredericksburg. Albert continued to serve with the 4th Texas throughout the spring and summer of 1862. However, it was during the assault against the Union positions along Boatswain Creek that Albert was struck in the leg. After the battle, he would be taken to one of Richmond's many hospitals, likely Chimborazo Hospital, only to succumb to his wounds on July 14th, 1862. He would be laid to rest in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section. Only a few steps away from Albert is Lieutenant Pleasant S. Wood of Company C of the 4th Texas. He had enlisted in Robertson County, Texas on July 15, 1861. He would serve with the regiment and remain at present duty throughout 1862 until he was wounded in the left leg. On the 29th of June, he was brought to Chimborazo Hospital, where his leg was amputated. His condition had remained stable until July 16th, when he developed typhoid fever. He passed away on July 22nd, 1862. He was 28 years old at the time of his death. Finally, just down the hill from Lieutenant Wood is the final resting place of Private John Toomer Young. Born in Guadalupe County, Texas, he had enlisted with Company D of the 4th Texas on July 4th, 1861. He had remained present on all muster rolls until he was wounded in the right leg during the famous assaults. By June 29th, he had been admitted into Chimborazo Hospital, where he managed to survive a month after his wounding. However, he would succumb to his injury on August 6th, 1862. He was only 20 years old at the time of his death. To the left of the Texans was the rest of Whiting's division, including a brigade under the command of Colonel Evander M. Law, which included the 4th Alabama, the 2nd and 11th Mississippi, and the 6th North Carolina. They, too, participated in the frontal assault against Boatswain Creek, and, much like the Texas Brigade, suffered considerable casualties. In the 11th Mississippi were two brothers, Levi and Benjamin Wyndham. Levi B. Wyndham, who was born in 1843, had enlisted with Company F of the 11th Mississippi on October 1st, 1861. After being wounded in the battle, he would be sent to Chimborazo Hospital, where he'd pass away from his wounds shortly after, being interred at Oakwood Cemetery nearby many of the men of the 4th Texas. He was only 19 years old. Benjamin P. Wyndham was born on the 21st of August, 1838, in Alabama, and had also enlisted with Company F of the 11th Mississippi around the same time as his younger brother. He, too, would be wounded at Gaines' Mill, but would be transported all the way to Charlottesville to be treated for his wounds. However, on July 19th, 1862, he'd pass away and be laid to rest in the Confederate cemetery nearby the grounds of the University of Virginia. He was only 23 years old. Many years later, their brother, John Wyndham, would find out where his older and younger brother were buried, and placed for them their headstones, in tribute to his long-lost brothers. Towards the Confederate right, Longstreet's division had initiated their assaults in conjunction with Whiting's assaults. The Alabamians, under Brigadier General Cadmus M. Wilcox's command, assaulted Brigadier General Daniel Butterfield's New Yorkers, Michiganders, and Pennsylvanians. During the fierce action, the Alabamians suffered significant casualties. In one instance, the 11th Alabama's flag-bearer, after being wounded in both arms, had still insisted on carrying the colors and urged his comrades to tie the flagpole to his back, even as he was being relieved. On the opposing side, Butterfield's men continued to hold the line, even as the center of Porter's line was broken through. During the firefight, Butterfield himself was wounded, and, with the collapse of the center, his men were forced to retreat from their position. It was because of his staunch defense at Gaines' Mill that Butterfield would be awarded the Medal of Honor. Towards the Confederate left, D.H.L's division had assumed their position, facing against 5 Union artillery batteries along with the 3rd, 4th, 12th, and 14th U.S. regiments under Colonel Robert C. Buchanan's command. Brigadier Generals George B. Anderson and Samuel Garland had taken up the far left flank of the Confederate line, next to Cold Harbor Road, just south of the crossroads. Directly forward of them was Battery A of the 2nd U.S. Artillery and Battery I of the 5th U.S. Artillery. Garland's brigade directly assaulted the batteries, driving them back and capturing several of their guns in the ensuing fight. Towards their right, Jackson's detachment arrived to the field and began their assault as soon as they arrived. They clashed with the 16th and 27th New York, along with the 96th Pennsylvania and the 5th Maine, driving them back. Subsequently, the artillery batteries behind them, Battery D of the 5th U.S. Artillery and elements of the 3rd U.S. Artillery, abandoned a number of their guns as they withdrew from their position, leading to their capture. In the fight, the 12th North Carolina, under Garland's command, assaulted Battery A and I. In the fight, Private James Crowder Jones of Company E was wounded in the face and neck, likely from a spray of canister shell. He was able to hold on and assist in the capture of some of the guns of the U.S. artillery. However, his wounds were grievous, forcing him to be sent to Richmond to one of the hospitals there. On July 14, 1862, 2 weeks after the battle, he had succumbed to his wounds, passing away and being buried in Oakwood Cemetery. Jones was from Cleveland County, North Carolina, and had enlisted with the 12th North Carolina Infantry on April 28, 1862. He was only 18 years old, leaving behind his mother, father, and many siblings. By dark, the battle was over. The Army of Northern Virginia had won. Fitz-John Porter and the 5th Corps were on the retreat, crossing the Chickahominy River as swiftly as possible. In spite of the coordination issues, the Confederates had achieved a major victory against the Army of the Potomac, Lee's first major victory as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. However, the cost of the battle was immense. There were over 15,000 casualties on both sides, though the Army of Northern Virginia suffered considerably more. Over 8,700 men of Lee's army were either dead, wounded, captured, or missing. Porter's 5th Corps was not in much better shape either, suffering over 6,800 casualties during the fight. Many of the dead and wounded of the 5th Corps were left in a hurry, and though the Army of Northern Virginia collected many of the wounded, they only remained there for 1 day before continuing Lee's grand plan. Most of the dead would lie where they fell for years afterwards, startling the armies when they met again in June 1864, and becoming the topic of some of the most disturbing photographs of the war. Though the battle was costly, it was a major success for Lee. His army now threatened McClellan's lifeline at White House Landing, poised to cut off the railway line linking them. Over the following days, McClellan would go from knocking on Richmond's doorstep to huddling at Harrison's Landing on the chains, from besieger to besieged. The most dramatic turn in fortune for the Union was about to unfold.